All right, well, welcome everyone to another edition of 1881 What's on Tap. My name is Josh Prue. I'm thrilled to be here with you today. Joining us today, we are excited. We have some fantastic Huskies who work in the brewing industry as well as wastewater industry and faculty members from the University of Connecticut. We're thrilled to be here today. Tonight, we find ourselves venturing deep into the world of water. We're talking Kevin Costner and Waterworld Deep. So if you don't get that reference, it means that you were born sometime after 95 or so. Go look that up. It's really one of his best, and I mean that sarcastically, movies. But we'll talk about everything from water purification and filtration to prepping water and balancing pH levels, all the way to the water being discharged out of the brewery and regulations. So buckle on up, grab a life jacket in case you fall in, and grab some beer, crack those cans, and let's get into this tonight. Before we jump in, just a couple of quick housekeeping items as we usually do. First, closed captioning is available. So should you wish to utilize this service, visit your Zoom toolbar and select the CC option and activate your subtitles. My colleague, Kate Krause, is actually joining us tonight, our Director of Alumni Relations for the School of Engineering. She is actually just dropping in the chat right now. If you need further instructions about that, Kate is available to help you access that, and we'll be also engaging with you in the chat today and handling any of our technical challenges that might pop up that we may be able to handle from where we are. Also, as we've learned from all of these discussions here, this is the best place that you can connect with other Huskies. So jump on in the chat, that's open. Share what you're drinking tonight. Let us know where you're logging in from. We find that people log in from all different parts of the world and the country. So we want to hear where you guys are logging in from tonight. Tell us what your favorite breweries are. If you love these two breweries that are joining us tonight, let them know that. They are Huskies through and through, and they want to hear that their fellow alums like their beer as well. Let us know about experiences, share your Untapped handle. We have a number of different things that people generally jump into in the chat, so feel free to start dropping those in there now. Next, if you have questions tonight as we go about things, you can definitely ask those questions of our panelists. We have a Q&A function right on your toolbar. When you have questions, just drop those in there. The chat tends to fill up with locations, with other concepts tied into beer. This way, our panelists and our moderators can keep a streamlined list running through of all the things that are coming through. So if you can drop that in the Q&A, we'll be able to keep track of that and get to as many as we can throughout the program. Huge thanks, as I mentioned before, to my colleague Kate Krause for jumping in tonight and helping out. But you're here tonight to talk about beer, so let's get into that. We're thrilled to have some of our featured guests tonight. We have fantastic representation from Connecticut and our Connecticut breweries. We have alumni working, as I mentioned, in the beer industry who own and brew at Great Falls Brewing in North Canaan, Connecticut, Brewery Legitimus in New Hartford, Connecticut. We have a fantastic Husky who is an expert in wastewater engineering, but I'll let them introduce themselves in just a minute. But I get the pleasure of introducing one of the jewels of the UConn faculty. I know I probably am embarrassing him by saying that, but Dr. Jeffrey McCutcheon is a full faculty member in the Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering Department. He's a graduate of the University of Dayton for his undergrad and also received a PhD from Yale University. His accolades run a massive list. I really encourage you to take a look at his biography on our event page to learn a little bit more about his history, but a couple of quick things that he is known for. He has pioneered work in the membrane-based separation technology. He's also raised over $10 million to support research in this area, in areas of forward osmosis, membrane distillation, nanofiltration, reverse osmosis, pervaporation, vapor permeation, organic solvent nanofiltration, and additive manufacturing for membranes. If you don't know what I just said, I don't either. He's going to tell us about it, so it's okay. You're in a good company today. We'll take care of that for you. He has published over 90 referred publications, written 3 book chapters, has several patents out there on membrane technology, holds numerous appointments, received countless awards for water technology and membranes, and so much more. Jeff, thank you so much. It's awesome to be working with you once again on another project to bring our Huskies together. I will turn this over to you, but again, huge thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much, Josh. I'm not sure I'm a jewel. I do shine the more hair I lose on top of my head a little bit, but I don't think I'm really a jewel. But I appreciate the introduction. It's great to be here and great to see all of our alum joining us and filtering into the room tonight. I am a transplant from Ohio, as Josh said, from the University of Dayton, where I grew up in the Dayton area. And I've been in Connecticut and now a Husky for about the last 13 years. And it's been a great experience for me to really engage with the New England community through UConn and UConn alum and our students. So it's great to be here today. As sort of a moderator for this panel, I have a lot of water treatment background, and so I'm going to let the panelists do most of the talking. Though because I think they have the interesting stories to tell as it connects to the microbrew industry, especially here in Connecticut. And so what I'd like to do right now is to go around our panel and have them introduce themselves, where they're from, and a little bit about their background, about what they'll be contributing to tonight's panel. And so I'd like to start with Christina. Would you care to start?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be getting into this discussion. My name is Christina Sayer. My husband and I started Brewery Legitimus just a little bit over 5 years ago. We're located in New Hartford, Connecticut. For those of you who don't know, that's kind of in the northwest corner of the state as you enter Litchfield County. Prior to opening this business, I spent the bulk of my career in human resources leadership for some large corporations. I worked for Coca-Cola, FedEx, and just most recently UTC, and then jumped into this full-time a couple of years ago. One of my passions, I'll tell you, I'm not a brewer, but I am a business woman. I got my MBA and my undergrad at UConn, and then went on to get my law degree at Western New England University. But I do know the importance of good beer to business. You cannot sell bad beer, and water is key to that. So I'm excited to be able to get into the discussion tonight. One of the things I am passionate about is changing the landscape of the brewing industry and helping folks that have been in underserved populations get into careers that are non-traditional for them. So helping women get into brewing positions, helping minorities getting into brewing positions. And so, as a part of that, I'm volunteering as part of the Brewers Association's Mentorship and Professional Development Subcommittee, which just helps in that area. So something I'm passionate about. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Christina. It's great to hear your story and a little about your background. Let's go over to our other brewer on the call tonight, Chris.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Go Huskies. Wanted to just say we're here in the northwest corner as well in North Canaan. Great Falls was founded in 2017. We opened our doors in 2018, so we're just coming up on our third birthday in a couple days. My background, I was a graduate of the CLAS and biology. Started off as an ecologist and went off to get my PhD in ecology. Spent 12 years as a professor at Endicott College. I've been sort of around the globe as part of that former life, and all along the way, beer has always been part of it. I've been a home brewer for over 25 years now. Seems like yesterday, actually. One of the great things about switching a career like this is just meeting new people and the passion that's out there for the brewing industry. And it was nice to sort of follow that trajectory for the last couple of decades, and now to be part of it and to meet the people who really love beer. And it's also fun to sort of watch where the beer industry is going. I'm really excited for the next stages that we see coming up. And there's lots to do in terms of what you can learn in this business. As a former professor, learning is near and dear to my heart. So I'm really looking forward to tonight's activities.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. And another UConn alum, Uday, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Go Huskies. I'm actually fortunate to have had Jeff as my faculty advisor when I was doing my dissertation at UConn. I graduated in 2014, and my passion as part of my academic career and currently as my professional career in wastewater is in wastewater treatment and all things wastewater. So I used to drink a lot of beer. I still drink, but now I understand how much of the water goes into it and comes out. And then I'm excited to kind of share my thoughts on what's going on. Thanks.
That's great. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for being here today, and for Josh and Kate for helping put all this together. Water and beer is a really important marriage. Beer is mostly water, and so we're going to be talking tonight a lot about what goes into the water that goes into our beer and what comes out of the brewing process, which has to be managed carefully when the beer is being brewed. We're going to be starting off, for those of you who are maybe a little less familiar with the beer brewing process, with a brief tutorial on how beer is made. That will be run by Chris, and what we'll do is I'm going to ask all of the attendees, if you have questions, please use the question and answer feature. You can also put questions in the chat. I just might miss them, but if you put them in the question and answer feature, we can make sure we can get to all your questions, perhaps in real time. So thank you. I'm going to hand this over to Chris so he can tell us a little bit about brewing and how it works.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. So if we're looking at the figure that's posted that you can see in front of you, we're going to start at the top left portion where you see where it says malt. So the four main ingredients of beer are, as this evening's talk is about, water, but we also have malt, yeast, and hops. There are other things that you can add to beer, but those four basic elements are what defines beer. The first step in that process of making beer is malt, and malt is simply dried barley for the most part, or grains. You can use oats and a few other grains out there, but primarily barley. Then you go and take that malt and you have to open it up in order to expose the sugars that are inside that malt, which is the basis for which we're going to start the first couple steps of brewing. And that process is called milling. And it's basically a big spinning blade that cracks the malt and it exposes that sugar. And then you put it into a tank with warm, hot water. And that process is called mashing. And that process takes usually about an hour. Temperature somewhere anywhere from 140 to 160, depending on the styles of beer that you're interested in. And malt can be, and just as a quick aside, since this isn't about malt, but malt has many varieties out there, and they go from very light to very dark. And those help determine the styles that you're working on. All right, so back to mashing in the mash tank. So after about an hour, you go through a process called lautering. And that's basically pouring water through that mash to remove as much sugar as you can. That can be worked on by yeast later on. And that lautering process sometimes is done in the mash tank. And then you lauter into what's called the brew kettle. Now, sometimes you'll see other vessels out there called whirlpools, and we'll talk about that in a second. So once you lauter all the wort at this point, that liquid that you've poured it over from lautering into the brewing kettle, that's called wort. So that's unfermented beer at this point. You'll see up at the top there, you can add in hops. Typically at this stage, you would add in what's called bittering hops. And this process, again, can last anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours, and in some styles even longer. You boil the beer, you can add in other adjuncts, but typically hops are there. Then the next critical stage here is, because you were working with boiling water and you don't want, an infection is always something that you concern yourself with in brewing. You want to cool that wort down as quickly as possible, and you're going to add it to yeast. Now, yeast in the water is very sensitive, so you have to put it through what's called a heat exchanger, and that cools down the beer into the 60-degree temperature range, which yeast typically operates, and it's done very efficiently and very quickly. So you want to move the beer as quickly as you can. And if you follow the arrow down on the right-hand side of the figure, you'll move into these what are called cone bottom tanks or fermenters. There's all kinds of different styles of tanks. And then that's where the yeast and the wort work together. And at that point, the fermentation process starts almost immediately. And if I just back up with the water, The water comes in at the mash side, and the waste comes out after mashing. It's called mash out, where you take the grains out. And then the other part of water is at the end of fermentation, you end up with a bunch of waste product. And don't want to steal anybody's thunder from later on. But so after fermentation, which typically, again, depending on your style, 7 to 10 days for ales. Lagering beers can take anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks after that. So it depends on the style. There's 2 different styles, ales and lagers. So after fermentation, we move them over to what's called a conditioning tank. In the business, we call them bright tanks, BRITE. And depending on how you condition them, you can usually clear up in about a day to several days. And then from there, you would go on to what's called packaging, and we put it into bottles, cans, and kegs typically. Sometimes you can move them into what's called serving tanks. So if you've ever been to, there's a couple breweries out in Colorado that I know of, but basically stainless steel tanks that will hold the beer and basically use that for the tap. But that's effectively all the brewing process from beginning to end, and where the different ingredients are added.
Great, thank you, Chris. That's great. That's really interesting. I noticed that there's that it looks like it's a single pathway for all of these flows. I'm assuming that there are places where things are added and things are taken out as well, such as we're going to be talking about this later about how the waste products, the solids, and some of the waters will also be leaving this process as well. And it'll be interesting to see where those things are added or where those things are taken out.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, great. Well, according to our schedule, we've come to our first fun part of the evening, which is our first tasting of a beer, and we'll be tasting our first beer from Legitimus tonight. So I believe Christina, you'll be leading us in this tasting.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm just gonna open mine, and this beer you can you want a nice head on this beer, so you can kind of, pour it aggressively. Yep, you've got it right, church bowl. This is a Kolsch style beer, and Kolsch originated in Cologne, Germany, not too long ago. Actually, it's not a very old style, but it's an ale. It's a very light ale, you can see, and we filtered this beer, so it's going to be clear and kind of a straw yellow color. This beer, we feel, showcases our water source here in New Hartford. We actually make no adjustments to our water profile for this particular beer. We use the water as it is. Our water here in New Hartford actually has a very low mineral content. And so it's perfect for this particular type of beer. If you taste it, you're going to get a nice crisp flavor, not a lot of hop bitterness, just a little bit of a crisp bite, a little bit of a soft sweetness from the German Pilsner and Munich malts. What else can I tell you? So it's an ale. But we actually serve it to a lot of people who are looking for a lager. Now, I think Chris mentioned lagers tend to take a little bit longer time in our tanks. And so for smaller breweries, it's difficult with the capacity that we're working with to do a lot of lagers. So we brew this beer for those people who are looking for that nice lighter beer, who like the lagers, but we can do this one in a little bit less time. So this one is done with a German ale yeast that specifically works in colder temperatures. So typically ales will ferment in temperature ranges around 65 to 72. This one is done in temperatures below 60, similar to how you would do a lager. So cheers.
Cheers. So, Christina, you mentioned that that the fermentation takes place at lower temperature. Is that what makes them take longer? I'm assuming. Is that why they take longer, and you have a capacity issue at times if you want to do a lot of these lagers?
Right. Yep. Exactly.
Interesting. Well, you mentioned some interesting things in describing this beer. It has a really nice smoothness in the aftertaste. I noticed when I tasted it, I really liked it. Um, so it's delicious. If anyone has any comments about the beer, if they're tasting it at home with us, please leave those comments in the chat. I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. This is my first ever virtual tasting, and I can tell you I like it. It's nice.
It's certainly, you know, those folks who are hesitant to drink a craft beer. You know, we get everyone in this tap room, from, you know, the beer geek on this side of the spectrum to the, you know, I don't like beer at all. And you know, we find it a challenge to be able to offer a beer that everyone can enjoy. And so, you know, when we get that person who says, I really only like, you know, insert macro beer name, this is the beer that will give them to kind of hopefully, you know, get them over the edge.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, I noticed that in your description, you talked a little bit about the profile of the water that you use to make this beer, and I think this is what we're going to be talking a little bit about in our next section of this panel, which is water quality of the water that's used in the actual brewing process. And so I'm hoping that maybe Chris and Christina, you could tell us a little bit about how much water you guys use in your brewery, and what specific water quality features you look for in that incoming water to make your beer consistent and also flavorful. Why don't we, Christina, you were telling us a little bit about the water for this particular beer. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you guys manage your incoming water and what you do to make sure that it works for your beer.
Sure. So we get our water from the town of New Hartford. There are actually two wells that service our water, and we actually test our water quite frequently to understand what the starting profile is. The town of New Hartford doesn't treat our water with chlorine, so we don't filter our water here. We use it as is, but we test it frequently to understand what the mineral content is, to ensure that we're getting a consistent profile. And then, you know, basically to make each beer, I talked about how our water profile is well suited for this particular beer, the Kolsch, and we don't treat that water at all to make this beer. On the other end of the spectrum, if we're making a stout, we are treating the water quite heavily. So we start with softer water. We have to add salts to make sure that darker beer comes out appropriately based on our water. So we're actually hardening the water a little bit for darker beers, if that makes sense.
Interesting. Is there any particular reason that you have to do that? Is that about flavor, or is it about the fermentation process?
So it's really about when you're mashing in. So Chris talked about that first process of extracting the sugars from the malts. A darker malt can be more acidic, and so you have to treat your water to kind of balance that acidity. Otherwise, you're bringing too much of that acidity out of the malt, and you're just going to have off flavors.
And so that's where the hardness can come in to help to balance some of that acidity, perhaps.
Right.
Chris, does your brewery also do this? Do you guys treat some of your water and maybe not treat other water depending on what you're making?
Well, our source water is from the reservoir here in town, and there is some chlorine treatments to it. So we have a large carbon filtration system in here, and we also test our water like most good breweries do, and we understand sort of mineral content. I mean, we're very fortunate in this part of the state. Is one of the few that has natural calcium in the geology. It's a limestone lens that comes through the corner of the state, and there's limestone quarries nearby, and we think it contributes considerably to the base water. But we'll typically look at the water and add calcium chloride or gypsum, calcium sulfate, depending on where we're trying to get to. And as Christina said, most brewing, we want to hit between 5.2 and 5.6 pH in the mash. And there's a number of factors that go into affecting that pH. Residual alkalinity is one of those other things that we are focused on. And we are, when we add things to it, it's to try and strike that balance between, again, the temperature affects pH, the malt affects the pH and the water itself. And so when we filter, it's primarily to remove chloramines, which is residual chlorine in the water. What's nice, if you balance your chlorides properly, you add a lot of, you can add sweetness to your beer. That's what that chloride element does. And also you want to make sure that you have enough minerals to support the health of the yeast. And a lot of that stuff comes from the malt. So you don't want to bind too much of that up as well. So there's a number of factors in there when it comes in there. For us, we do treat the water, but we think that the base water is pretty good for making our beers.
If you're getting reservoir water, does the towns do any kind of like centralized softening or anything like that to remove any of the calcium sulfates or anything like that, or do you get pretty hard water?
I don't think our water is too hard, so I can't answer directly whether they treat it or not. I haven't looked into that matter. You know, we know what the water profile looks like coming in, and we look at it at least once a year. But I would say probably, given how much calcium is in the base rock around here.
Yeah, definitely. We have a question from someone online. This is from Susan. Why do you need calcium in the mashing? I think, Christina, you may have gotten into this a little bit in your answer because of, I think you mentioned acidity. Can you maybe answer this question for our attendee? Oh, you're muted, Christina.
Sorry about that. So there's really a range that you're looking for depending on what type of beer you're brewing. So calcium is really, you know, for a pilsner or a lager, the one that we just tasted, you're going to want to be kind of on the lower side, maybe like 50 parts per million. For a darker beer, you're going to want to go a little bit higher on that calcium. You know, it's really about providing that nutrient to the yeast and ensuring that the water is right to have that pH that Chris was talking about, that 5.6, that balance of the pH. You don't want to, it really just, if you're not in that balance, you're going to extract the wrong types of flavors for beers, and you're going to get a beer that's tasting too bitter or too sour, or you know, some minerals can even add kind of like a metallic taste. Off flavors are something that in the brewing world we're always super careful about. We want to make sure that we're not sending beer that has that negative or off flavor, and really, you know, the water is a very important piece to that. We're also constantly tasting our beers, so we'll set up a panel of our production folks, taproom folks, and we'll sit down and we'll pull some beers off the draft lines. We'll crack a couple of cans and set up a tasting panel to see, you know, are we seeing the same flavors from the draft line versus the cans? Is there something that we've done in our process that might have affected those flavors? You know, we're tasting all the time just to make sure that we've got it right. That was probably a long answer to your question.
No, it's great. It's interesting to see the kind of control that you and Chris have to deal with when you're mashing. This is like one of the early stages of the brewing process, and how important it is. Now, I have what might be a silly question, but I know that there are beers that are called sours. I don't know much about them or how they're made. Does the sour taste come from mashing it outside of this pH range? Maybe if either Chris or Christina want to take Chris.
Yeah, so the development of Berliner Weiss, what we do is kettle sour them. There's a couple different ways to sour a beer, but in kettle souring, we actually use yogurt and lactobacillus to lower the pH at the level at the kettle on the kettle side. So this is after mashing in.
We actually go ahead.
Go ahead. Nope.
I was just going to say we actually use a specific yeast that is produces that lacto flavor.
So yours is at the fermentation stage, is when you're getting that sour flavor,
right?
And Chris, yours is at the kettle stage.
Well, yes, and then we also use yeast that's specific to the Berliner Weiss class of beer, style of beer.
Okay,
that help adds that. Yeah, yeast choice is definitely very important.
Yeah, I can't say that I've ever acquired a taste for sour beers, but I think Jody, who's listening, does tend to like them. So, Jody, please keep the questions and comments going. We like to have the conversation about this. So now, Christina, you guys don't have chlorinated water, correct?
That's right.
So it comes from the city though. So is it like ground? Is it like basically large well water?
It's a well. It's well water, and they sanitize it with UV.
Okay, so there's no the chlorine is a residual that is important to keep the lines relatively clear in case there's any breakage. I think Uday knows a lot about these kinds of systems. But if it's ozonated at the source, then it has to get to your facility and it still has to be relatively clean. Do you do any kind of disinfection prior to brewing?
No, we're boiling the water to put it into the mash, but that's it.
Okay. And Chris, you actually have to dechlorinate your water before you start your process, but then your system's already sterilized. I'm assuming, correct?
Yeah, in brewing in general, we spend a great deal of time making sure that things are clean through a clean in place process, CIPing. So we use both acidic and basic treatments for the stainless steel. It's very easy to hide unwanted bacteria in your brewing materials, especially if you're dealing with 600 and 1,000 gallons at a time. And so everything is very closed loop from once the wort is over into the kettle, once it's boiled, everything's in sealed process. And the only time, for example, that you would open up to the air for a very brief time is if you're dry hopping, for example. You open up your dry ports, but you spray everything down with isopropyl in our case, or acetic acid, peracetic acid, whatever you're using to clean, keep things sterile. But everything that comes close to contacting the beer, it's sterilized.
Excellent. I think they used Uday, were you ever part of the beer brewing class at UConn when they were running it or anything like that? Or have you ever been?
No.
Have you ever brewed? I think they used bleach when they brewed in our. I'm not sure how they got rid of the aftertaste. I think if Jen Pascal were here, who's been on some of these panels before, she might have some other perspective on how they sterilize some of their small batches in our class.
Yeah, I think
on that note, like, do you guys keep track of the water obviously you're paying the bill, so you probably need to keep track of all the water you use. And do you guys, does it change seasonally, or how do you guys, how does that all work out for you guys?
So we keep very close track of the water that we use because we pay some of the highest rates in the States, in New Hartford. Unfortunately, our water treatment plant was built for a much larger population, and it just never came to fruition. And so the folks that are hooked up onto that system kind of pay the brunt of a bigger system than is needed for the population. So we're paying about 3 cents a gallon for water and sewer rates. So we keep very, very close eye on the water that we're using, and we train all of our employees that have access to water, how to conserve it, and so we get to be environmentally friendly and also economically friendly for us. So I would say, there's kind of a statistic out there that says that for every gallon of beer that you produce, there's 7 gallons of water used to go into that. We recently did a little rough study, and it's hard to know because we operate both a production facility and a tap room here. So we have bathrooms, we have dishwashing, we have other sources that use the water. But since we pay for it, we know how much we're using. And we came up with an estimate of around 6 gallons of water for every gallon of beer that we produce, which is below the average. We think that's pretty good for a small brewery. And then we're about to invest in, Chris was talking about clean in place, or CIP. We're about to invest in a cart essentially that will recycle our CIP liquid. So right now when we clean a tank, we put the water and the chemicals in to sanitize that tank, and then we waste it. Whereas when we get this particular piece of machinery, we can recycle, reclaim that cleaning water and use it on the next tank and the next tank, provided that it's still the strength that we need it for. So that's one way we're trying to reclaim water in the process. We're also looking at, the other thing we do, we actually reclaim hot water from the brewing process out of the heat X into cleaning. So we take that heat exchanged water that's now cooled the beer and is coming out hot, and reclaim that to use for cleaning. So that's another way that we're trying to conserve water. And then finally, we're looking at some additional tanks, and it's probably kind of next generation brew house, where we'd have a cold liquor tank and a hot liquor tank that would allow us to reclaim that heat X water from the brewing process, put it back into the hot liquor tank, keep it warm, and use that for the next brewing cycle. So we hope that with all of that, we can get down to like a 4.5 gallons of water for every gallon of beer, hopefully.
That's an ambitious target.
It's ambitious, and we're hoping we can save ourselves some money too.
Yeah,
That's
I think
great.
you're really gonna enjoy that CIP cart. It's a game changer.
Do you have it, Chris?
Yeah, we've had it from the beginning.
Oh, have you?
Yeah.
Well, we won't talk about the shipping crisis, but we have a couple tanks that are on their way from China, and that's what's holding us up for quite a few months now.
Yeah, I bet.
And so, Chris, do you also see similar savings in using these kinds of recycling systems, or are your water prices lower and therefore you're not as needing to be as conservation minded from an economic standpoint? Maybe you could tell us a little about what you guys do.
Yeah, so we have, Aquarium is the source, as the company that runs water in a large number of municipalities in the state of Connecticut. And so we sort of save on that large purchasing power. So we pay, I believe, 100 cubic feet of water. So it's about 7.48 gallons, I believe, per cubic foot. And so we don't see as large a bill on the water side. On the sewer side, it's local sewerage fire district that runs a antiquated sewage treatment plant. And so our waste is all side stream away from that. It wouldn't be, it's not able to handle it. And so we work with a local farmer to take our cleaning and brewing waste and our trube, which is what we call the sort of leftover plant and yeast material after fermentation. And we bring it over to the farmer. They put it into a biodigester, and the biodigester they use to make potting plants out of cow manure called manure pots. And they're sold all over the world, and it helps their business. We've been able to manage our costs pretty effectively down to using a truck to haul totes around, which now it's becoming kind of expensive to do, but fortunately the farm's close by. So.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about some of those waste management practices here in the upcoming section. But I think now might be a good time to also take our next break and to taste our next beer, which comes from Great Falls. Chris, you want to take this one?
Yeah. So this is a lager. This is a true lager. This is Canaan Mountain Lager. You should have the short can. And this beer is American style. There's different kinds of lagers out there. There's German lagers and Czech lagers. This is American style. It's primarily made with 3 ingredients: flake brown rice, crystal hops, and pale malt, Pilsner malt. Sorry, and it's an ABV 4.6. It's been lagered for clarity. Treated a little bit with calcium chloride and calcium sulfates to get that clarity, and add a little bit of that sweetness, which comes from lagers, which a lot of people like. And if we crack it open, I'll just note that on the can, it has nothing to do with water, but the can is a picture of Canaan Mountain, which if you came to the brewery up here in North Canaan, if you were looking behind the building, you would be looking up at Canaan Mountain itself. So it's a little paying homage to our local, the local features around here. So if you give it a sip, you should get sort of a very that sort of clean crispness that is typical of American lagers. It's got a little bit of that bittering, just a touch of that bittering crystal hop in there. And the other thing is this is a great lawnmower beer if you're outside. That and our other lager, which is Lime Rock Park Lager, we make a joke about it. There's this lawnmower beer association that's fully approved.
I thought I got fruit taste when I first tasted it, but now I'm not getting it again. That's interesting. I noticed also it's a little hazy. Is that normal for?
It really shouldn't. It should be a little bit clear.
Maybe that's just condensation on my glass.
It could be. Brewers will use to get sort of things cleaned up. They'll use if you're a home brewer, sometimes you'll use isinglass, or you can use what's called biofine, and that helps precipitate any of the colloidal protein solids that might be still floating around in there. Typically with lagers, you just want to go through that process of lagering and let it all settle out naturally. So you leave nothing in there. Not that any of those additions add much in flavor, but you really want that beer to be crisp and clean. Lagers are if a brewer can make a good lager, it's a hallmark to his, or it's a statement to his brewing abilities. Brewers judge each other on their lagers, not on their IPAs.
Why is that? Is it because it's harder to hide things in a lager, or is the IPA such a strong flavor you can sort of get away with things?
Well, a couple of those things. Exactly. You can't hide anything in a lager. It's just straight beer. The second is it's a little more technical because of timing. What happens in the fermentation in lagers is sometimes you'll develop acid diacetyl, which is that popcorn butter flavor, which is not desirable in beers. So if you don't go through a diacetyl rest when you're making a lager, you'll pick that up there. Even a little bit of diacetyl is a killer for a beer style like lager. In some beers, it's some of these off flavors are desirable, but not in the case of a lager. No. So you'll see brewers exchanging lagers, and they'll let you know whether you've done it right or not. But yeah, that's the first cue. Can you make a decent lager?
So when you guys brew for like 4 to 6 weeks at a time, I guess, so that takes up the entire, like depending on how big a brewery is, you're brewing a lager, that takes up most of the brewing capacity you guys have. So you guys have to plan around it, or how does that work?
Yeah, there's different ways you can handle it. If you have a lagering tank, for example, you can transfer it over to the lagering tank so it can spend that time clarifying and getting the flavors right. But yeah, I mean, if you were to put it in the fermentation tank and leave it in there, it would tie up more production. And so people try and steer clear of it unless you're making a lot of it.
Yeah, we typically will only dedicate one one tank to loggers just because it, you know, capacity the way it is. We need to turn beer so much quicker, you know, when how we're selling it. So we did buy a tank that, you know, we can put into, we can kind of move around. So sometimes we'll take our loggers and lager it in that tank, which provides us a little extra capacity. But yeah, you have to plan really closely, especially being, you know, at the size that both Great Falls and Brewery Legitimus are. You know, you really do have to plan those beers out way in advance.
But you might imagine, back to Uday's earlier point about, you know, seasonal usage of water, if your brewing time is longer, your water use is probably less during that time too, because you're not turning over lots of batches. And so depending on what you make, your water usage also will change. Well, this is great. This is fantastic, and thank you very much, Chris and Christina, for showing us some of your lighter beers. And we'll get to some IPAs later in the evening. But for now, I think we're going to move on to our next section of tonight's discussion, which is, as opposed to the water that comes into all these brewing processes. Now we'll talk about the waste that comes out. And this is a really interesting challenge and opportunity for brewers, from what I gather from talking to both of you and Uday about some things that are happening. And I think Chris alluded to this as well, about what they do with some of the waste. So I'd love to hear a little bit about this. Uday, you may have, did you want to talk about some of this? Are these your slides or are these Chris's slides? I'm sorry,
I think whatever waste is being generated in the brewery, I think it's more apt Chris and Christina talk to it, and then I can kind of dive into what happens to that.
All right. Excellent. Well, if there's any need for the slides, you can call on Josh to pull them up. So Chris, let's start with you, since you mentioned this in your last discussion point on creating interesting products with your waste. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing in this side streaming process? Maybe tell our attendees what side streaming is, and what are some common practices in the industry.
So the two main sources of waste for during the brewing operations is the grain that's spent. We call it spent grain. That's in the mashing side of the brew process. And we'll do something called mash out. So we get these big totes and literally take a rake and pull it out of the mash, and we'll hose it down and put it in there. And that waste, even in bigger brewing operations, most breweries will move it to farm so that it can be eaten by livestock, primarily around here, cattle and pigs. There are some breweries that will put the grain down the drain, but we're talking about large organic matter. And just sort of as a backdrop on our background information about that, when you put stuff into a sewage treatment plant, organic matter can have a big impact on its functionality. You're talking about bugs that need oxygen in order to sort of remove, to make the waste, potable water going into water receiving bodies. The other waste is when in the fermentation process, as I had mentioned before, in those in the original brewing process graph that I showed you, there's these tanks with these bottoms on them, those cone bottoms, and there's outlets on those cones. When fermentation is finished, most of the yeast dies off and starts to settle to the bottom. And will come through, and as well as the hops that you've added, especially in IPAs where you have a lot of dry hopping, and then any other proteins that left over from the grain that would have been in solution. So that all comes down into the tank. Now that's a lot of that stuff. If you're in bigger areas like Hartford and New Haven, they have really large sewage treatment plants, and that's the stuff that can be put down the drain directly. In those cases, and you would pay for that waste based on volume. You'd be metered as to how much you're sending down. In our case, we're not in that unique position. We side stream it like we do with the grain. So we literally In our case, we pump it out of the brewery rather than put it into a tote inside, and we pump it into totes on the outside, and then we haul that away. And so, we think that we've found some ways to close loop the life cycle of some of these raw materials. So it's, while we're industrial, we're sort of also good stewards, as it were, and reusing as much of the waste as possible.
So that's interesting. Is it complex to collect this organic matter? Is it difficult to, do you have to dewater it or remove some of the water before you can give it to the farmers or use it otherwise?
No, in this case, it just joins. This is a farm with 1,000 head of cattle, and so they have to collect all the waste and urine, and we're talking 25,000 gallons a day or more. So when we add our waste, it's usually typically on the order of 200 to 400 gallons on a day. So they don't see the difference in the quality of that waste. And then the biodigesters simply takes the organics that settle at the bottom of this and then run their biodigester. So we don't need to dewater it. In fact, in many cases, we have to liquor down the waste that we're sending to get pumped out because the sludge is too thick. And also, we want to make sure that the pH that we send off to the biodigester is neutral.
Christina, how does Legitimus handle its organic waste?
Yeah, so it's very similar. We're side streaming almost 100% of solids. So, I think this chart here shows you see our brewery and a couple of our employees here, but you'll see kind of in red, I've highlighted the areas that have the most impact from a wastewater treatment plant perspective. If we were to send all of these processes down the drain, we could throw off our system. I talked a little bit about our particular system in New Hartford is, was created for a large demand and is really only servicing about 330 connections right now. Just poor town planning, but in the early days when we didn't have a good relationship, or not necessarily a good relationship, but we weren't communicating with the treatment plant. There were one or two instances where we sent something down the drain, and they were like, "Hey, listen, guys, we can kind of smell hops down here." So, we have developed over these 5 years a very close relationship with our treatment plant folks. We just went on took our whole production crew over for a tour the other day. And I think it's important that you understand where your wastewater is going, even as a household user, right? We're talking to them and we're hearing about challenges that they have from the condos that are down the way that are just sending what they call fog, fat soils and greases. And you could see them in the screening process as we were walking through the treatment plant. So, we have had a very good relationship with our treatment facility, which is right down the road. And so we side stream 100% of almost 100% of our solids. So you can kind of see here in red the processes that are in the brew house that create those large BOD sources and suspended solid sources. And you can kind of follow it through, even just, how Chris was talking about the process, but you can follow it through to cleaning. So you see there, the spent grain is a huge contributor to BOD and suspended solids. The hops that you're putting into the whirlpool, those are going in a pelleted form, and then they're coming out in just kind of a sludge fashion. And we're basically extracting all the beer out of that boil kettle that we can, and there's some left over, and there's hop sludge that's also left over. So we're taking that and we're very simply just putting it into a very large tote and sending it to our farmer. Our farmer takes all of our spent grains. He relies on us for feed. So, we are actually in close communication with our farmers, well, it's probably one of the most important people in our process, because otherwise we would be paying to have this waste taken off site. So he takes it and he feeds his cattle with it. I mean, he depends on us to brew on a consistent basis. You know, the bottling and canning operations are a big source of waste as well. That's a little bit harder to reclaim into a side streaming operation. So that's probably one of the areas where it's a little bit more difficult to side stream, and why we're probably not 100%. Keg washing is another piece. But the big areas where you're seeing in red, the fermenters, that yeast sludge, that trube that Chris was talking about, we're dumping that into a big tote and providing it to the farmer for feed, and in some cases composting.
What a great symbiotic relationship you have with a farmer, where you save money
Very
by not.
much so.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So
Yeah.
I'm assuming there's no cost either way. They don't pay you for it, but they take it off your hands essentially for free.
We are very, very happy that he takes it off. And the other thing is, think about in the summertime. In the winter, it's not as big of a deal, but the minute that grain, that spent grain, sits in a warm temperature, it starts to decompose and produce a odor that is unpleasant. Pigs love it, cows love it. In fact, I've heard that the pigs love it a little bit ripe. But that relationship is key, because if he says he's going on vacation, which he never does, we're left kind of holding this grain, and in the summertime, it's definitely not a pleasant situation. So he's on speed dial. I think all of our production folks, they know his phone number by heart, and he comes down right away. It's a great relationship.
So Uday, I want to get some of your perspective on some of this. There's some interesting organics management practices here. We've also heard about a small wastewater treatment system not able to handle the organic load. Maybe you can give us some perspective on your thoughts on waste management.
Sure. Actually, I would like to congratulate Chris and Christina, because they're doing a great job in handling their waste, because I'm sure there was a trial and error, but where they are right now are trying to optimize what comes in and what leaves, because what leaves is as important as what comes in. I know beer is all water, or mostly, but there's a lot of water which goes into it, but at the same time, a lot of waste is generated. And if you don't handle it properly, then you're going to be in trouble, no matter what kind of system you have, be it an in-house system, or if you're connected to the sewers, or like Chris and Christina are two ideal examples of. Christina is connected to a sewer system, and Chris unfortunately cannot use the sewer system he has in town because they're too small to handle the load which comes out of a typical brewery. And I think, Josh, it might be good to move to the next slide so that we can kind of give an idea on what goes on. So when we talk about brewery waste, or be brewery waste or the waste which comes out of a household, it's all the same components, but the concentrations are completely different. So it's typically the organic matter, as they've kind of alluded to, be the mash, beer, whatever comes out of beer manufacturing process. It's the organics, and it's the nutrient load associated with those beer production. And then all the grains and yeast and everything, spent grain, all that adds to the suspended solids component of the wastewater leaving the system. So if nothing is done and they just let it go into the wastewater system, then you have really, really high organic load and suspended solids. And then what happens is, when they hit, or when they even go into the sewer system, they may clog the sewer systems, or worse, when they go to the treatment plant is not designed. The treatment plants of the past were not designed to handle brewery waste. They're meant to handle domestic wastewater. The example here is, I guess, Christina, you can correct me, but for a brewery generating 10,000 barrels, I had to look it up what barrels is. It's like 31 gallons. So a brewery generating around 300,000 gallons of beer per year, which is like 850 gallons per day, is the same equivalent strength as 1,000 homes with approximately 4,000 people. So that's around 200 to 300,000 gallons per day of wastewater. So don't confuse with the wastewater volumes, but the strength of that much of beer wastewater is the same as 1,000 equivalent to 1,000 homes discharging on a given day. So the magnitude is like way off the chart. So that's where the issue comes into play, where your treatment plants were not essentially built. The hydraulic capacity is not the issue, but the actual organic load which goes to the treatment plant is the issue, because the bugs which they use are not able to, they don't have the facilities to handle all that slug load if they were discharged into the facility. So that's where all the side stream processes come into play. Josh, maybe you can go to the next slide. We can kind of give an idea to the people on. So on the left, on the right, on my right, you see the domestic wastewater concentrations. So those are typical. They have been kind of established all across the country and pretty much well how much the BOD or the TSS is going to be. Versus the brewery wastewater, again, I have to kind of, this is like a snapshot because the brewery industries are still growing, so people don't have a good sense of what's out there. And based on what Chris and Christina explained in terms of what kind of beers they produce in-house, and even if they change slightly any of the process mechanisms, the waste generated will be there's like a wide range in terms of how much BOD comes out of the brewery versus what the domestic wastewater system can release. And then the last thing, we kind of touched on pH. The pH is a critical aspect because typical sewer systems in treatment plants usually handle neutral pH around 6 to 9, but the pH in a brewery can fluctuate based on what they're doing on a certain day. If they're brewing versus they're cleaning, it will change between 3 to 12. So that if they're not regulated, then they will have a serious issue if they're releasing into the treatment plant sewer system, where they can cause deposits or corrosion of the sewer system. That's my spiel, Jeff, on that.
Thanks, Uday. This is really interesting. You sort of nail this idea that the high strength waste coming out of breweries is actually quite challenging to manage. And it sounds like Legitimus and Great Falls have done a really nice job to sort of manage this without impacting wastewater treatment facilities in their areas. It's also interesting to see the difference in the water treatment systems that Christina, you and Chris, you have to deal with. They're very different. Like you have a large municipal city wastewater system with Aquarion. Christina, you're dealing with this very small town that has an oversized wastewater treatment system that's essentially starved. and this is and so it creates interesting, very localized, specific challenges to the water and wastewater treatment systems of the areas where breweries are set up.
I think too, if I could just interject one thing, that our treatment plant loves our food actually. So some of the wastewater that we send down to the system is actually food for their bugs. We just can't send them too much. So because they're undersized, they do actually want us to send, a certain amount down. So it's kind of interesting. There's a very fine balance.
Right, Jeff, actually, stores will really benefit if there's a brewery, especially when kids go away for Christmas and in the summer. And summers there's more people, but for that Christmas 10 days when people are gone and it's like 10 degrees, definitely the bugs are starving. I'm sure they have to manage some external carbon sources, but hey, maybe you could start a brewery and then.
Well, we have Dr. Jennifer Pascal on here. Maybe she could tell. She's listening. Hopefully, she's listening and will help us start a brewery on campus. So now you've heard it from an expert, Jen. It's time to start a brewery on campus. Oh, she's trying. Well, we've now come to our next tasting, and I know people have been patient. Thank you very much. This has been a great discussion, though, especially this area. It's a real sustainability centerpiece to brewing to see what people do with their organic waste. We're going to move to Lazy Hazy, which is one of our great Falls beers for tonight. So, Chris.
Excellent. Yeah, we're really happy with this beer. This is one of the earliest design beers that we had, and we felt like we captured lightning in a bottle early on in the development of our company. Classic New England IPA, dials in around 7.2 pH or ABV. I got pH on the mind here. It's made with pale malt, wheat malt, Pilsner malt, and a little bit of flaked oats. The flaked oats are for providing a little bit of mouthfeel, a little softer mouthfeel into it. And then it's dry hopped with Citra, El Dorado, and Mosaic. And this is a case where it's a complex recipe, balancing. We don't do much in terms of balancing the water chemistry on this one. We feel like it's pretty much where we want it in terms of magnesium and calcium. And the bittering is just is nearly perfect. We sent this beer a little old to the last Great American Beer Festival, and it still managed to get into the second round. And that's a tough crowd. There's like 1,000 beers that get judged. So we're happy that I think next year when we plan our brewing schedule, we'll make sure that we send out a good fresh batch of Lazy Hazy, and with any luck, it will win an award one of these days. But this is our flagship. If there are flagships anymore in the world of the brewing industry, it's definitely our top seller. People keep coming back to it, and have been for years. And this is a great beer. It's very crushable.
Well, cheers.
So I have a quick question. So double IPA for a layman, is it double hops, or is there anything more to that?
It's more about the ABV. Like, where does the ABV hit? So you have single IPAs, double IPAs, and triple IPAs. And the New England, Lazy Hazy is sort of on the high end for a single hop. So usually you're anything over 5, below 7, you'd call it a single. 7.5 to 9, you'd call it a double. 9, some 9s are triples, but 9 to 12 would be your triple IPAs.
It's double dry hopped, right, Chris? I think that's what Uday was asking about. It's double dry hopped.
Yeah, it is double dry hopped. Yeah.
Right.
And then the significance of hazy versus all the haziness, how do you manage to keep that, or like what you just don't filter it, or what goes on there?
Yep, we don't filter any of our beers, but yeah, so if it's managed by the protein haze that's in there to a certain degree, and it's a choice of malts, and just a lot of the haze is contributed by the hops as well.
It's delicious, very smooth, very drinkable, very enjoyable. I can see why it's I see what you mean by lightning in a can, right?
Lightning in a can, yes.
Actually, we had a question on this that I'd like to pose to you and Christina about how should you drink beer? We're on our third tasting now. This is a good time to pose this question. And Joyce asks if you should drink beer directly from the can, use a mug, a stein, Pilsner glass for the best taste. Do you have a recommendation for how we should be sampling these beers?
I mean, I would recommend pouring it into a glass. So a lot of beer tasting is actually the full sensory experience. So when you taste a beer, if you want to get the full flavor profile, if you take a deep breath in and then take your sip, you're going to get that hop flavor and aroma all at once. And that's how you're going to truly taste the beer. But you know, if a can is all you have, that's also good. You're drinking craft beer, you're drinking local craft beer. You know, but ideally, especially for an IPA, I think you can get away with a can for a lager, something that doesn't have that really rich aroma that contributes to the flavor of the beer. But for an IPA, ideally, you like this isn't necessarily the true glass, but something that concentrates the flavor when you pour it. So there's something called a teku glass that has a little bit of a flare at the top, a very small opening on the glass that allows you to kind of breathe in deep that aroma, that hop aroma, and then you go from there.
Yeah, I would say that there's a program called Cicerone, which is the parallel to wine sommelier, and they do have a fairly complex recommendations depending on styles of beer that you're trying to drink. But to Christina's point, I think, you know, it's that idea that you can engage that nasopharyngeal, your nose, as part of the drinking process if you really want to enjoy the full creativity of a beer. And that teku glass is definitely it's a favorite among brewers. If you've never seen one, TEKU is the name. But there's lots of glassware that's specifically designed for that engagement. But companies like Alchemist, for example, say right on their can, drink from the can. So
I was wondering, should I bring it up or not? I did have Alchemist, and then the Heady Topper too. I think they are very particular, drink from the can, and then they're very small batches. You have to find them. So
sometimes that's about the what you're seeing in the beer. Sometimes they have some yeast suspended in the beer, and it's not necessarily pleasing to the eye. So, but people love it.
We had a follow-up question that actually from Jen. Should the glass be chilled or room temperature?
No,
Christina says no.
Chris, you can answer. We always, you know, when we go out to drink a beer, taste a beer at a bar that chills a glass, we always cringe and just kind of like, you know, swallow. It's not the appropriate way to drink a beer, and it's not sanitary.
Yeah, agreed. And it also tends to cause breakout. So the CO2 that's trapped in the solution of the beer, in a really cold glass, you'll get CO2 to separate out of it. And when that happens, you're starting to lose flavor of the beer as well. We always slick our glass. There's it's called a sparkler. We usually shoots water up into the glass, and that helps with the pour of the beer into the glass, and then helps our patrons enjoy that beer to its fullest.
Well, thank you very much for that. That's a great tasting. I'd like to move into our last section for the panel today, and I again encourage anyone who has questions for our panelists to ask them into the question and answer feature of Zoom. We might have a couple minutes after this last section, but we're running a little bit short on time. I appreciate everyone sticking around and talking to us tonight. This last section I wanted to discuss is regulatory issues. So both Christina and Chris have alluded to some of these issues. Having a good relationship with the wastewater treatment plant and the utilities in a town are really important, because obviously you want to make sure that you don't damage the town system or whatnot. And since you're both in very different environments from a regulatory standpoint, I'd like to hear your perspective on when you started your brewery. What kind of regulatory issues did you have to did you run into, and maybe some pardon me. I'll hand it over to Christina first while I try to knock off.
Sure. So yeah, when we first started, we were actually licensed number 34 in the state of Connecticut. So that meant that we were the 34th brewery to have that particular manufacturer of beer license. I think there's 125 breweries now. So Deep has started to realize, and maybe Uday can kind of elaborate on kind of the technicalities with the licensing, but they're moving towards regulating breweries as industrial users. So in the past, we were able to discharge into the wastewater systems without permitting, and now we're required to go through the permitting process. And this is something that has highlighted our relationship with our local treatment plant professionals, one of which is a Mug Club member at our brewery. So it helps because we can bounce ideas and questions off of him. And the permitting process is about that thick for what we're considered, which is a miscellaneous industrial user. And then there's another permitting process or permit that's called a significant industrial user, and I'm sure that's even worse. But our relationship with the wastewater treatment plant professionals has been key to moving through that permitting process. Imagine kind of overnight, you're not regulated, and overnight you are. So and you don't necessarily have the knowledge and understanding of what is needed to go through that process. So they did some visits while we were going through all of the different processes in the brew house, and watched what kind of processes were. They just watched us. How are we rinsing tanks? How are we brewing beer? What chemicals are we using? And we had to provide documentation on all of those chemicals. And so the process has been made simpler because of our relationship with those folks. That's about all I can say on that.
What was your experience like, Chris?
So there's with waste and regulation in the state of Connecticut, there's sort of two. There's at the local level, and some local levels are large municipalities gathered together. So MDC, for example, in Hartford handles the waste from multiple places. For us, it's a little bit different here in North Canaan. There hasn't been a significant industrial input of new business in North Canaan in some time. So the wastewater treatment plant, sort of by grandfathered use, allowed us to sort of pour down the drain. And for the first year, it seemed to work. But every sewage treatment plant has to report back to DEP on a Friday, I guess, on Fridays or whatever their designated time is, to show them that they're functioning, that the bugs that are working in the sewage treatment plant are at a sufficient level to handle the waste load. And largely because you're trying to protect, in our case, the Housatonic River is behind the sewage treatment plant. It got to the point where our cleaning, our efforts were not sufficient to keep the bug load high enough for them. We worked with them using an online Google tracker for effluent and when we put waste down, so they could find out exactly how that had an impact on their processes. But in the end, it was realized that it just the quantity at the BOD, which is the biological oxygen demand created by our waste, and the total suspended solids that we had going down the drain were too much for the system. And so we developed this other plan. Now with the state, the DEP was pulled in because the reports coming from North Canaan suggesting that there was a problem, and they wanted to see but they were already thinking about the brewing industry anyways. One of the main enforcement officers for DEP actually happens to be a home brewer. He has since retired, but he was very interested in this and the fact that there were more and more breweries being put online, particularly in smaller municipalities that had never seen these kind of loads before. And so they're going through a whole concerted effort to do two things. One, to have a business-friendly BMP, best management practice, for the larger breweries. So when you think about Two Roads or Thomas Hooker, those larger breweries that are in the state, when they're sending 10 times, 50 times more waste than we are, how does that work in the system, and what do you do with that evolution going forward? And the second thing is that they are interested overall in BMPs for everybody. And so we're actually part of a study going on right now. We're one of 3 breweries in the state of Connecticut as part of this DEP research for best management practices. How do we, is what we're doing formidable and in such a way that more breweries can take advantage of it? and then the other is to sort of manage the water resources in the state in concert with keeping the balance of the economics. They're really interested in the economic side of this. And so we're hoping that we'd be part of this white paper that will come out of this study to provide to breweries in the state of Connecticut.
Very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Uday, what's been your experience with this? Do you have any perspective on regulatory issues as they pertain to breweries?
All right. So I've kind of like researched everything going on in the state. Connecticut is like an odd man out in the New England area where they recently changed the rules, as Christina was trying to kind of mention, that the onus is on like the breweries have to still go through DEP, but in a way they have to work very well with the local wastewater treatment plants to figure out how much they can send, if they can send their waste there. Like other states like Massachusetts, Rhode Island, they kind of established a system where they know how many industries are in the system, and then they're tracking, and then they tell each industry, this is how much you can discharge. I think Connecticut is catching up to that point where, and now the towns are having to like take it up on themselves to figure out, as Chris was trying to mention, there are not many industries, but still they need to figure out how much their system can handle. So the bottom line is, I think having a good, wherever you are, even if you're starting a new brewery or as an existing brewery, having a good relationship with the local wastewater treatment plant folks, because they are the people who you're going to call at 11 p.m. to tell them, hey, or they're going to call you back and say, what do you guys do? So having that good relationship helps no matter where the rules are coming from, because at the end of the day, you guys, once you have a good relationship, you can figure out the best way to send the waste out or not. And then the irony of the big breweries, maybe they're also in big sewer systems like MDC, New Haven, Stamford. They treat like 100 MGD. So they have the capacity to accept that kind of load. So they probably don't really feel the pain, but most of the craft breweries, as we see them, are opening up in small towns, and like they're trying to kind of revitalize the industry. So as they're doing that, they're trying to open up in small, quaint towns, and then they probably don't even have a sewer system, or their sewer system is so antiquated that they need to figure out a more realistic way of handling that waste, because at the end of the day, the brewery is bringing people over, and it's an economical benefit for the town. They don't want to lose them for anything else. So I guess that's where the whole evolution of trying to work together and kind of making it like cohesive way of handling the waste is the best way to deal with it.
Yeah, I'm particularly heartened by the fact that the DEEP is sort of promoting research in this area to kind of create best practices and standards.
Right. It's definitely proactive now than being reactive. I'm sure when they started the 10 licenses or 20 licenses, they kind of like had to bear the deal with the aftermath of what's happening, because ultimately, as Chris mentioned, the treatment plant, if they're discharging mostly into rivers or streams behind them, and then if they're violating the permits, they are paying the fines, and then in turn they are coming back to the breweries to make them pay the fines or surcharges, which can cut into the profits they're trying to, or even sometimes break even. So that's where the kind of trying to balance out how much they really want to work with you. At the same time, they don't want to surcharge. So that's where the kind of the cost benefit and break even aspects of how best we can make the waste work. And even Chris, I'm sure you kind of looked into the aspect of either storing for long, like few days at a time, and then having a septic hauler come and take the waste versus having small totes go out. So those are all things, I mean, breweries are across the state are figuring out, and then as things kind of progress, I'm sure DEP will have more a uniform consensus on what the best way to deal with that.
Thank you, Uday, for that perspective. Well, I think it's time for our last beer tasting for the evening. So I think we have one more IPA. This one comes to us from Legitimus. So Christina, you want to talk about Dr. Strange Haze?
Sure. So, so this is one of our flagship beers, one of our most popular. This is a what you would call like an East Coast style hazy New England IPA. We use Citra and Mosaic hops in here, so you're going to get on that first kind of punch of aroma, you're going to get the citrus fruits, that tropical nose. Very hop forward beer. So this beer is all about the hops that we use. We actually go a little bit off here and give this beer a little bit of bitterness to be a little bit different. And so you're going to taste it and you're going to get just a slight hop bitterness, not something that would be as much as you would get from like a Sierra Nevada West Coast style IPA, where it's just, you know, super high in bitterness. This one's 6.5 ABV, so it's a nice, you know, crushable beer, as we would say in the industry. The reason you're getting that kind of hazy appearance, which, you know, the trend really is that hazy IPA appearance, is the proteins in the grains. So we use wheat and oats for that fuller body and that hazy appearance. We do adjust our water profile for this beer. We balance our sulfates and our chlorides to accentuate that hop flavor without the super bitter characteristics from the hops. We want to take the fruit, the citrus from that Citra and Mosaic hop. So we do add magnesium sulfate and calcium chloride to the water to adjust it for this particular beer. Cheers.
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 So when you guys say flagship, is that the most popular, or is it won awards, or like how do you guys determine? Does it change at all over the years, or?
So Uday, this is the beer that we will never run out of, and if we run out of it, you know, me as the MBA, the businesswoman coming in, will be knocking on production's door to understand why we are running out of it.
I mean, it's
Yeah,
also
so
a
this
good
is
sign that it's still popular, and then if you run out and like it kicked, like yeah, okay.
right. So this is why we don't, you know, we can't have several tanks dedicated to lagers, which are the sweethearts of the brewers. You know, if I were to, you know, give this business over to the folks in production, they'd be making lagers all day, and you know, we'd just be, you know, we'd have a bunch of brewers here in our tap room, but you know, this is not what sells beer. Yeah, so you know, to not get punchy about it, but from a business perspective, we do need a beer like this. You know, typically, you know, we'll have this in cans and on tap at any given point. I would say, you know, in the first couple of years as we were trying to figure this business out, you know, we ran out a couple times, and you know, you get people knocking on your door and they're just like, where's your IPA? I remember distinctly in our first year, it was probably in our first 4 months or 6 months, and we didn't have a lot of breweries to kind of model off of, because we were kind of early in the process. We had no IPAs on tap, and we just got lambasted by customers coming in. They're like, you don't have an IPA, this is ridiculous. And so we've learned over our 5 years that this is, and that's why it's our flagship. So this is the one that's the most popular for us. You'll see it on tap, you'll see it in package stores, you know, next to some of our other mainstays. But yeah. And I'm sure Chris it's the same with Lazy Hazy, right? You know, he's
100%.
nodding. You know, he's going to be knocking on production's door if Jonas doesn't have this in a tank at all times. I mean, you know, a tank is necessarily dedicated to stream chase at all times.
Well, thank you for that. This is also an excellent one. Thank you thank you everyone for letting us taste your beers this evening. This has been very enjoyable. We have 2 questions remaining that I'd like to get answered. We'll start with maybe a simpler question first, and then we'll end with a student question from a student. So Susan asks about the lautering stage of the brewing process. Chris, I think you mentioned that the sugars are being washed out during the lautering stage, but don't you want to keep the sugars in during fermentation? Can you maybe clarify what you meant by washing out sugars?
Yeah. So in the mashing process, you actually have live enzymes that are converting polysaccharides into starch into more basic sugars. And so those sugars are free between the grain, and you simply use water, what's called sparging or vorloffing, where you move the water through that column, and then you open a port at the bottom of the tank, and that collects it all, and that moves it through, and you port it over to the kettle. So that's how you get the fluid, the liquid created without the grain. That's full of, they call it sugar water, the sugar water over into the kettle. So that's what we mean by that. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. We keep all the sugar.
Okay. That's what I thought. I think when we hear washing out, we think of washing out and getting rid of. So
yeah. And to that point, when Christina was talking about testing, tasting everything along the way, you can taste the first runnings to find out how much sugar. You can taste the sweetness in that wort and how well you did during the mashing process, during the vorloff, and if you got it all. And that's how we actually measure efficiency in the brewery too. How much sugar did you get out of it?
Great. And to kind of wrap things up for the evening, I'd like to address this question from Maya. I think Mia or Maya, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but she asks about, she asks if the resources and processes in brewing your beers are environmentally sustainable. This is, of course, a very important thing for many people today, as well as many of your customers who are sampling your beers. Can you maybe summarize for everyone who's still with us tonight, kind of your environmental sustainability mission regarding water use and wastewater management, and how that's part of your mission as your brewery? So we'll start with you, Christina, if you want to start.
Sure. We take a lot of direction. We have a great association. I talked about at the beginning that I'm proud to be a member on their diversity board, but the Brewers Association provides a great deal of direction and assistance to small independent breweries on topics like this. Because if you can imagine, the bigger breweries have the financial clout to be able to have these large sustainability missions and goals, and they almost have to, right? But when you've got all of these smaller breweries coming on board, the economics of running a brewery are a little bit tighter when you're smaller. And so the Brewers Association provides a great deal of information and tools on sustainability. They actually have a whole very nifty kind of sustainability tool that you can download and use on a smaller scale, which is excellent. I think we take a lot of direction too from kind of the West Coast, right, where we've got just over almost 1,000 breweries in the state of California, which experiences year over year record droughts. And so there are some breweries out there that are actually, and I thought this was interesting. It may turn you off a little bit, and certainly from a business perspective, I was cringing a little bit. But Stone Brewery, which is well known, even out here in the East Coast, did a beer where they took wastewater, toilet water, and I think they called it toilet to tap. So essentially not using any water from the ground, but completely recycling water to put into a beer. And I think I can't remember the specifics around it, but the mayor of the town or whatever came and drank the beer and said it was very good. So, there's a lot of work being done in this area. I think breweries are realizing the need to, both from a business perspective and just from a moral perspective, become more environmentally sustainable. It is hard from a smaller brewery's perspective to be able to spend lots of money on your own wastewater treatment facility. The bigger guys can do that, but we can't. But there are so many resources, even just working with your local treatment plant to understand, how you can conserve water, and it does relate to economics too. So I don't know if that answered the question, but I wanted to talk about toilet to tap.
Absolutely.
I thought it was a good way to end.
Well, it's an interesting concept that might Josh spur an entire new 1881 series. Chris, what about your operations? About how does sustainability woven into your culture?
Well, as a former environmental scientist and a professor at a college where I taught hundreds of students about environmental sensitivity and stewardship and responsibility, it's been an eye-opening experience running a company, because at least from the water perspective, I will say that we live in New England. We are blessed with water sources to no end. We have aquifers that are full. And so water is less of a conservation issue for us. We do close the life cycle loop of water in terms of waste when we take it to the farmer. I think there are other environmental impacts. When I was an environmental scientist and doing research in forests, I planted hundreds of trees. I think in running the brewery, when you see all the CO2 blow off that's occurring during fermentation, it makes me, sort of makes me cringe about all the trees I planted. Maybe they're taking up all that CO2. But you see a lot of technologies coming up. Like, for example, if you go to Two Roads and take a tour of their facility, they no longer let free CO2 rise out of their fermentation process. They recapture it for later on down the production cycle when they put it back in the beer to carbonate it, which I think is fantastic. And then in terms of wastewater, other places that don't have the advantages that we have in terms of farmers, there are companies like, not to plug any particular company, but a company out of Vermont called Champlain builds local sewage treatment plants that you can put on site, which will reduce everything down to a material waste that could be side streamed pretty easily. And the water can be reduced down to 250 parts per million in terms of the BOD, and can actually be put into the sewage treatment plant, no matter how old your sewage treatment plant is. So I think there's definitely some great technology that's coming out. I think we're seeing this being played out in towns everywhere, whether you have a brewery or not, and just sort of modernizing. And so it's sort of an exciting time in that sense. But in terms of us, I mean, honestly, when we get profitable, I'm going to buy some carbon offsets for our environmental stewardship. Maybe have like a tree planting day with the brewery, which would be kind of fun. There's definitely places where we could replant to get our energy. We use a lot of energy in the process. So yeah, I'm revealing a little bit of my environmental guilt in running a company, but it is part of the process.
Beer brewing does have a CO2 footprint.
Yes,
it does.
Yeah, I didn't add that to my caveat. Carbon dioxide, like greenhouse gases, is definitely a contributor. So
I see some of them in there. Yeah.
Right. So I know we are. I have to reiterate. New England is blessed with so much water, but if you go back out west, they're strapped for water. Every drop of water counts. So breweries are so innovative, and they have to, because if they want to survive, they need to adapt to. And then that's where the new technologies come into play. And then the societal taboo about toilet to tap, I don't want to drink it, but then come on, you need to get over it. I think we need to adapt to like changing climate and everything else going on, and then take the aspect of trying to drink treated water, which is really good.
I think they would, though. I don't know that anyone would give up beer.
That's true.
I think as long as you masked it with beer, they would drink it regardless.
Right.
I think what people need to understand is that we already do toilet to tap. We just have the environment in the middle.
Right.
And so it's not really too much different. Most of the wastewater we put into the rivers and oceans is cleaner than the water that we're putting it into. So, but well, I think with that, I want to thank all of you guys for being with us. Christina, Chris, Uday, your perspectives have been really exciting, really interesting, and enlightening. I'm going to hand this back over to Josh to bring us home this evening.
Thank you so much, Jeff, to Christina, Uday, and Chris. Thank you so much for all the insight today, for the great beer. I had the pleasure of visiting both Brewery Legitimus and Great Falls just before the Thanksgiving holiday, and I can tell you there's no shortage these days at Legitimus in terms of IPAs. I believe I had a flight of 4 IPAs, so if you're interested, Christina's learned her lesson. That will never happen again. And for those hopheads out there, it's a gold mine. You know what you're getting into when you go out there. And she knows that the haze craze is here to stay, and that's definitely something there. But one thing I will point out, Chris, y'all had Black Friday. You had nothing but stouts on tap. So
Yeah.
for those of you out there, I know Tom may be listening. It's stout season. It's always stout season, so you can go out there. And you can go and try a number of different things out there. So there's tons of opportunities with these great breweries, and to get a chance to try some fellow Husky brewed beer, it's well worth the trip. I live in the northeast corner of the state. Chris and Christina are in the northwest corner of the state. It's worth the drive. It's gorgeous, and you get some great product out of it. So if you get a chance and you didn't have a chance to participate in the tasting today, definitely go out there and check them out. Go see them and ask for them. I'm sure they'd love to chat with you and hear your Husky story as well. Again, huge thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. Huge thanks to our panelists. This has been a long time coming, and we're thrilled to be able to share this with the School of Engineering, and Jeff for leading the charge here, and for my colleague Kate for helping to bring us all together here. A couple of quick notes for those of you that are interested in the 1881 series. We have a couple of things coming down the pipeline. One, we have the Science of Coffee, which is a new offshoot to the 1881 series, which is kind of delving into the other vices that we have in life. You may have already participated in the dairy bar one we did last month, but now you get to get into the coffee aspect. So we're doing the Science of Coffee. So if you're interested in that, that's December 14th, 6 p.m., same bat time, same bat place. So we'll be back here on Zoom. You can sign up for that at foundation.uconn.edu under our events section. Also for 1881 fans, mixology is coming back. The last one we did was quite a while ago now. We did a whole focus on gin. This time we're tackling all things rum. So for those of you that are interested, the world's oldest spirit, we're going to be doing mixology based on all rum drinks. That's going to be coming on January 24th. More information and information about signing up for that is coming. And then an American whiskey is going to be the next one that we're going to be doing, talking mostly about bourbon. So if you're interested in any of those, we've got some great mixology concepts coming down the pipeline. If you want to tune back into this, pick up something that you might have witnessed along the way, you can visit youtube.com/UConn Alumni for more information. Later this week, we'll get this up there and shared with all of you. And that's pretty much everything I've got for this evening. Thank you if you stuck around for the extra 20 minutes we've been here. Again, Christina, Chris, Uday, Jeff, awesome stuff. I think I can speak for everybody. When you can mix beer, science, and learning about these great things and environmental sustainability and things of that sort, there's no better combination, right? I mean, we're talking, we're drinking, we're having a good time. All things great that, surprisingly, UConn alums like beer. Go figure, right? So,
Go Huskies.
On that note, Christina, really quick, do you want to talk?
Yeah.
Before I forget, you have a beer, and I want to mention this. You talked about toilet to tap. Can you talk about the beer that Brewery Legitimus does make? I know that you included it for the panelists, so we could have something. I know it's available at the brewery, but can you quickly, for like a 30-second elevator thing, tell us what that is?
Yeah. So we make a beer. We collect maple sap in this early spring sap running time frame, whenever it's running perfectly. We buy it from a maple sap producer, and we brew the beer entirely without water. So sap is it's a flavorless, colorless, aromaless water. It's mostly water, but it's also sugar. So in the brewing process, it adds fermentable sugar to the process. And it doesn't necessarily, when it's just beer, we did a 12.5% Belgian triple. When it's just the beer, it doesn't have that mapley flavor, just a slight bit. But we aged that beer in 3 different barrels. We had a cinnamon whiskey, a cognac, and a bourbon barrel that were last holding maple syrup. So it's got that maple flavor from the maple syrup in the barrel. You've got the bourbon, the cognac, the whiskey flavor. So that's the 2020 version. Unfortunately, the timing was not such that we had the 2021 version, but we're bottling it probably this week. So anyone that's out in the area and wants to come say hi, we should have that hopefully on the shelves by next week. And it's very small batch. It's a Belgian triple. It's very high in alcohol. So we do it. That was a small bottle. We're doing it in a little bit bigger of a bottle this year, but nice to share for the holidays. Thank you for letting me talk
Awesome.
about it. I was excited to talk about a beer that did not use any water whatsoever.
Well, we spend more time talking about toilet to tap, but I think that maple syrup to beer, I think, is a cooler, I think more palatable for most people at this point to try first.
Right.
All
And
right,
a lot
well,
of
on
people
that
are
note-
drinking maple sap too, which is, it's got a lot of health benefits. So
There you go.
Yeah.
All right. On that note, I know we're running past our time, so thank you again to all of you for sharing your evening with us. Christina, Uday, Jeff, Chris, from the bottom of all of our Husky hearts, thank you all so much for joining us. We appreciate you taking time today. Go
Yeah,
Huskies, go
thank
turn
you.
the game on. CBS Sports Network, we're playing right now. So
Yes.
Oh, no.
go change over and jump on that. We'll talk
Get
to you all
outta here.
soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Take care.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.